Good evening, everyone. My name is Olivia Saya. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Thank you for joining us tonight, especially if you are joining an MHS program for the first time. We are an independent nonprofit organization that maintains a research collection that includes close to 14 million manuscript pages. We hold the papers of US presidents, factory workers, mothers, activists, and artists. For the past 230 years, we have been making our collections available to researchers and the public for free. And we host a wide variety of events, such as this evening's event. We are only able to provide access to our collections and host programs like this thanks to the support of our members and donors. And for tonight's program, our speaker is Katlyn Carter, who will be in conversation with Nathan Perl-Rosenthal about her new book, Democracy in Darkness, Secrecy and Transparency in the Age of Revolutions. Katlyn Carter is a political and intellectual historian of the 18th century Atlantic world, specializing in the American and French revolutions. Her research focuses on the origins of modern representative democracy through the study of political practices and institutions. She has published in the Journal of Early Republic and French History and has written numerous op-eds for the Washington Post, Time, and the Age of Revolutions blog, for which she serves as an editor. Nathan Perl-Rosenthal is a historian of the 18th and early 19th century Atlantic world. He focuses on the political and cultural history of Europe and the Americas in the age of revolution, with particular attention to the transnational influences that shaped modern national politics. He published a first book, Citizen Sailors Becoming American in the Age of Revolution, which won the Society for French Historical Studies Gilbert Chenard Prize. His second book, The Age of Revolutions and the Generations Who Made It, will be published in 2024. I'll now turn it over to Katlyn and Nathan, and Katlyn will start us off with an introduction to the book.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Thank you all for being here, and Nathan especially, who's joining us from across the Atlantic in France. So I really appreciate that. It's great to be back here, even though virtually at the MHS. I conducted a fair amount of research for this book in the reading room at the MHS. So I'm very excited to talk about the book and have a conversation with Nathan. And if I understand, Nathan has some questions to start us off talking about the argument of the book. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to him.
Oh, cool. Well, first of all, it's a great privilege to be here. I also have very happy memories of research at the MHS, and I'm speaking to you from Paris, and I'm just delighted to have the privilege to be in a conversation with you, Katlyn, about this amazing new book that's just come into the world. You don't have a copy of it, do you, in front of you to hold up?
Actually,
Let's see it. There we go. Okay, there it is. So yeah, I mean, I think I just wanted to make sure, since there are, many people on here who probably haven't had a chance to read it since it's only been out for what, a week. Um, I think it'd be great if we could sort of first spend a few minutes just talking through what the book does. If you want to start by giving us your, elevator pitch, we can go from there. But I think it'd be great to just give people a sense of what you do, how you do it, and then we can kind of get into the guts of the book, which is exciting.
yeah, that would be great. So this is a book that's really aimed at understanding the origin of modern representative democracy. So these two things, representative government and democracy, were once considered distinct, even incompatible by some people in the 18th century. And my book tries to look at how this concept of representative democracy was born and came to be so naturalized to us today. So to do this, the book kind of zooms in on debates about secrecy and transparency in government, which often got linked to underlying ideas about how political representation should work, and what made it legitimate as a tool of popular sovereignty. So what made political representation democratic, so to speak. So that's kind of the top line. I'm happy to go into the findings a little bit or talk about how the argument unfolds.
Well, maybe situate us a little bit in time and space first. I mean, so the rise of representative democracy is a big topic, and you're really focused on a particular place in time here. So if you could tell us a little bit about where situate us in place and time, I think that'd be great as well.
Yeah, so this book takes place in the 18th century age of revolutions. And what that really means is it starts kind of mid 18th century, 1750s or so. Part one of the book really looks at the Enlightenment and kind of this period right before the outbreak of the American and then French revolutions. And it really looks at a mounting suspicion of state secrecy across the Atlantic world and how that suspicion got connected to calls for reform to representative government or to, in the French case, establish representative institutions where the people could have a say in government. So it starts there and then it moves forward to what I call the revolutionary moment of the creation of the United States. So the Federal Constitutional Convention taking place in 1787 through the early 1790s and the early origins of the American federal government, and the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 through the early revolution and into the period known as the Terror. And then the book really wraps up by looking at the late 1790s and kind of closes up with the turn of the century in 1800, looking at kind of how these governments kind of took off and how the meaning of transparency sort of got changed in this period from something that implied a more active dialogue between citizens and their government to something that was a little bit more akin to spectatorship and sort of broadcast on the part of the government. So it kind of wraps up with the election of Thomas Jefferson in the United States and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte in France, which I kind of take as the end of the revolutionary period in these two places.
Right. Right. So, I mean, we should definitely come back to this, this idea of active dialogue and spectatorship, which is, I think, so crucial. And I really want to talk both about how you show how it emerges, but then also the implications of that for how we think about democracy today. I was wondering, though, before we sort of get into the nitty gritty, can you say a little bit more about how because you talked about both the United States and France. How do you move back and forth between those places in this book? Because it's uncommon to have a work of history, especially a first book, that really straddles the Atlantic in this way. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit, and maybe that's a question about how you do it in the book, and maybe it's a question also about what your experience was of writing a book that does those things.
Yeah, the book really aims to be a transnational, somewhat comparative history of the American and the French revolutions. And to do that, it really has to move around the Atlantic world. So it flows broadly chronologically, but it looks at sort of it uses connections between these two revolutions in order to kind of structure the narrative of the book and tell this story. So, for example, it kind of starts out by looking at the rise of the imperial crisis in the British Empire, the outbreak of the American Revolution, and then from there kind of looks at the impact of the American Revolution in France on the financial situation of the state, but also some of the ideas coming out of the American Revolution and how those reverberate in France. So it kind of goes that way, and then it kind of jumps back across the Atlantic to look at developments, and it kind of just follows the story chronologically, but moving back and forth in a way that gives a sense of how actors at the time, historical actors, were also very aware of what was happening in other contexts and were often communicating with one another or reading about and talking about what was going on in each context and how that was influencing their thinking about decisions they were making in their own national context.
Right. I mean, I would just, I was so struck by the way in which you end the book, not to give everything away, but in the epilogue, you actually start by talking about Jeremy Bentham. So an English thinker who was influential to both Americans and French both American and French thought in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I think that it's a nice another one of these points of connection that you create, a sort of triangulation even.
Absolutely. I mean, Great Britain is a presence throughout the book. And for Americans and for French thinkers, England and English history is often a point of comparison that they're using. And it can even be kind of a connecting point between France and the United States, where a lot of things are kind of going through there. So, as you kind of mentioned, it's sort of a triangulation sometimes. But yeah, it's always a presence. And then you also have thinkers and politicians in Great Britain who are also, interacting and looking at what's happening in the new United States and in France and writing about that, or as Bentham was doing, offering his expert opinion on what they should do in these other places.
Right, right, right. So I think we should talk a little bit about the this big argument that you make about sort of the conflict, in a sense, between representative government and democracy, and the way you try to think that through in the context of secrecy and publicity. So can you give us the kind of, again, the kind of arc that you tell in this book? What's the, sort of how is what's the transition that you see taking place over the time period of the book in those pieces?
Absolutely. Yeah, so when I say that representative democracy was not really a concept and that some people thought of those things as incompatible, it's so naturalized to us today. Representative government is kind of the main form of democracy that we think of. So it can be hard to step back and think about a time when that wasn't really taken for granted. And what I mean by that is just that when people in the 18th century are talking about democracy, they're often talking about it in a sense of kind of an ancient form of government, either like direct participation of citizens in governance. That's one way, or maybe thinking about it as one element in a mixed government. So, like in the English government, the House of Commons might be the democratical element, in contrast to the monarchical and aristocratic elements of government. And so, in a lot of senses, when I say people thought it could potentially be incompatible with representation, representative government was still essentially the few speaking for the many. It didn't mean that everyone was going to be participating in decisions. And so that created sort of a challenge. And it kind of forced an argument about then what was political representation for? How should it actually work? And you had kind of a contingent that argued that, direct democracy was not possible. Everyone pretty much agreed direct democracy was not possible. Societies had become too big for that, too complex, and there were a lot of obstacles to it. You did have a contingent of people like Tom Paine, for example, who were arguing that, well, it's not possible, but it would be ideal. And so political representation is just sort of a necessary evil because we can't have direct democracy. And for them, they really felt like in order to make a political representation as democratic as possible, what that meant is that you would have to ensure representatives reflected the wishes and sentiments of the people. And for them, that really required transparency. That really necessitated that the people, the public, be able to see and follow what their representatives were doing and to offer them feedback and serve as a guide for their actions. So you sort of had that contingent, but you had another contingent that started to argue that, actually, direct democracy is not possible. But representation is more than a necessary evil. In fact, it can be an improvement on direct democracy. And that was because it could bring together the most wise, enlightened, virtuous men to make the best decisions on behalf of everyone. And you had someone like Madison, early on in his career in the 1780s saying that, actually representatives might come to better decisions than if the whole population was able to come together and deliberate on their best interests, that these representatives might be able to reach something better. And for them, secrecy was actually a really useful way to insulate those representatives from popular pressure or too much influence so that they could have slow, considered deliberation so that they could reach decisions that were maybe not the most popular, but that they deemed the most wise. So you had sort of these two competing views for how representation should actually work, and what it meant to govern in the common interest.
Right. So you used these two words, but in the book you actually and in the book I should say not, but you really talk about them as models. The idea of reflective representation as opposed to insulated representation, and I think those are your coinages. And I just want to sort of underscore what you said here, which is that it's two quite different models of what representation is, right? One is the representative as a literally mirror of the represented, reflecting their opinions, presumably into government or into policy. And the other one is an idea of the representative as standing a bit apart from the people and with I imagine a wall with insulation between them and the people. And so they have this kind of um, a little bit of distance from the populace. Is that the right way to characterize it?
Yeah, absolutely. They're kind of two different models, two sort of extremes, and often historians, even political theorists, think about them as more or less democratic. So often you have historians and political theorists thinking about what I call reflective representation as a more democratic form of government, and insulated representation as a less democratic form. And what my book does is say, that is one way of thinking about it in terms of the process or the theory of how the representation is working. But there are other ways of thinking about it too, in terms of thinking about the outcome, for example, of those two processes, and how that doesn't always align. It doesn't always match that reflective styles of representation produce the most, what we might consider the most democratic outcome. So my book kind of complicates that a little bit.
Yeah. And I guess I just wanted to make sure that I am right about this. You think that both of these ways of thinking about representation are, in fact, to use a clumsy term, revolutionary. I mean, it's what we're talking about is an argument among revolutionaries. It's not like one of these is the conservative, the counter-revolutionary, the anti-revolutionary position. This is actually what you're looking at is really a dispute among revolutionaries, among advocates of representative government about the way, technically almost, you make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, they often tend to get portrayed as more or less conservative. But this is absolutely an argument that's happening among revolutionaries, and that there are a lot of disagreements about. And it gets put into practice in both ways, in both France and the United States. And it kind of swings back and forth between these, and it's never fully established in one particular direction. I sort of argue that over the course of the book that it moves from a more of a consensus around a reflective style of representation, which is part of what comes out of the American critique of the British notion of virtual representation is, no, actually, we don't agree with that. We want something that's more a reflective representation where our particular interests are represented and guaranteed. So it kind of moves from that idea toward a more insulated notion with the establishment of the federal constitution, for example. And we see the same trajectory of that in France, generally kind of a move from a more reflective notion toward a more insulated notion. And the book really talks about how procedural secrecy in government is really used to effectuate that kind of shift in terms of how the government actually works and what it looks like, despite a continued rhetorical commitment to transparency. So there's that kind of disjuncture that emerges there, where we have transparency continuing to be valorized. But it had really been born in support of this reflective ideal that the governments actually kind of move away from through the procedural use of secrecy. So in the process, they kind of argue that transparency itself becomes changed in terms of what that actually means or the effect that it has in these new governments.
Right, right. And so just to call back to the beginning of what you were saying, there was again that mention of virtual representation, which for those who are not who haven't spent too much time in 18th century history, is one of these concepts in British representation idea about how representation in Parliament works, in the British Parliament works, and it is I think as you say in the book, is very much in the minds this idea of virtual representation, that you are, even if you're not, well, you should say what you mean by virtual representation and why that's kind of a maybe a model, maybe a kind of anti-model for a lot of these revolutionaries.
Yeah, and the idea of virtual representation, it fits sort of under the umbrella of insulated representation, this idea I'm talking about, which is basically a lot of the people who start to theorize this say, well, even if you don't vote for your member of the House of Commons, that member represents your interests nonetheless. And that it's sort of an idea that the common good is formed in the House of Commons and that it emerges from that. And it's not something that exists outside among the people. And then they tell their MPs what they want it to be, and and the MPs have to try to reflect that. So there's kind of a rejection of that to say, actually, your MPs come, they're the ones who are actually have a greater view. They have your interests in mind, and they're supposed to represent the interests of the entire nation or empire, not come together and represent the interests of particular constituencies and then kind of cobble something together and arrive at a summation. So there's that kind of sense. And then the Americans, their problem with that is they start to say, well, we don't have the same interests actually as those of you across the Atlantic who are meeting in the House of Commons. And so they start to really reject that notion. And you can see with a lot of the state constitutions that get written during the Revolutionary War, there is really a much more of a commitment to a reflective style of representation where there is an expectation that those elected to the legislature are supposed to come and bring their particular community's interests to bear, and that there's a common good out there, and they're supposed to come and reflect it in their policy. So there is that shift during the war.
So you were saying, you say in the book or you've said in what you've, sort of just in laying out the arc of the book, that it really starts out the revolutionary era in the 1760s, 1770s, like 1770s, really, with a very strong reflective sort of trend. So how do you see that in these American legislatures? I mean, how does that manifest itself? Because I think part of what you're showing us is the importance of seeing how these things, not just the sort of concepts, right, that people are putting forward, but really how it works in practice. So in practice, how does this work in the legislatures of the 1770s and, in the United States, in the early United States? What does that look like for there to be reflective?
Yeah, well, so the part that I focus on in the book is looking at the decisions that they make in these state governments about what needs to be done in public view versus what can be done behind closed doors. And what I find is that this is the first sort of time that we really see being put into these constitutions and structures of government these decisions that there's something owed to the public in terms of them knowing what their elected officials are doing. And it takes varying forms, and there are different degrees of it. But in the most extreme case, like in Pennsylvania, for example, you have a guarantee written into the Constitution that the doors to their assembly will be open to the public, that they will print all bills and distribute them before they vote on them to pass them into law so that people have a chance to weigh in and give their opinions on them. And then you have other cases which are a little not so extreme, but still putting in guarantees that journals of legislative sessions will be regularly published. And these are new things to put down as positive guarantees for the government. It's only in 1771 that the House of Commons in England starts letting reporters come in and actually report on what they're saying. And they don't want to do that. They're kind of forced into that, and they kind of, grudgingly accept it. So what the states do in the US during the Revolutionary period, it's pretty, it's pretty novel and it's pretty radical in that sense. And it really does reflect this idea that these representatives are agents and servants of the people.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's terrific. And of course, I mean, the Pennsylvania Constitution is the greatest gift that anybody ever gave to American historians because it's always cited as an example of every radical idea of this is with the 76 Constitution we're talking about,
Yes.
yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Of every radical idea but it's, I think one of the thing that makes your point really powerful is that this is in fact common to a lot of the state constitutions in this period, right? This isn't just an idea of the wide-eyed, wild-eyed Philadelphia artisan radicals. This is a pretty widespread idea, and as you say, very novel as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the question that certainly I think many readers will have is so there's this moment of intense reflective democracy or representative democracy in the Revolutionary War years. Um, I would imagine many of the people in the audience here are familiar with the history of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which famously, I remember being taught about this in grade school. And the first thing they told us was it must have smelled absolutely terrible because all of the doors and windows were shut, and it was the summer in Philadelphia, and they were a bunch of middle-aged men stuck in a little room for all day long. So how do we get from point A to point B in 10 years, 11 years between the Pennsylvania Constitution and the Philadelphia Convention, even in the same city? How do we get from the doors must always be open to the doors are always closed? What's
Yeah. Well, so that's a whole chapter in my book looks at the Constitutional Convention and the reasons behind why it met in secret, the potential effects of that, and then the critique of that that emerges during the ratification debates. And, I too had heard of it before, but it's often kind of mentioned as, briefly in books about the convention or as a footnote. My book takes seriously that is a fundamentally important decision that is made and then debate that happens coming out of that decision about how government in the name of the people should function. And so it's part of a story about, the concerns that the framers had, and it fits very much in with the narrative of a concern about what they called an excess of democracy in the state legislatures. James Madison, for example, comes to Philadelphia worried that you have these state legislatures that are making what he considers bad policy decisions, often related to the printing of paper money or the easing of tax burdens on the populace in response to popular pressure, sometimes even threats of violence or the outbreak of violence, like Shays' Rebellion. So coming there and saying, the way these state legislatures are working is not going well, and we want to retool things. So historians have focused on different ways in which the Constitution itself kind of takes that on. I am looking at kind of the procedural decisions of how they actually make a constitution. And one of those important things is that many of them talk in their letters about the reason they decide to meet behind closed doors being partly to kind of avoid confusion or rumors, circulating publicly, but another reason being to promote what Madison at one point calls unbiased deliberation among the deputies. This idea that, they needed to insulate themselves in order to compromise, change their minds, come to agreements and have meaningful deliberation that was more than just, constant concern or catering to interests back home where they were coming from. And, Madison considered this so fundamentally essential to the process of writing the Constitution that later in his life, he actually wrote that without having met behind closed doors, he doesn't think writing a Constitution would have been possible. So it's very fundamental to this notion of that comes out of this period that, in fact, the way representative government should work and the way we can legislate or make constitutions in the name of the people actually maybe requires some insulation, and secrecy is one way of providing that.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think, and then I think you show quite elegantly also the way that this carries over into Congress itself. Once the Constitution comes into force, right, that Congress itself also has the ability to close itself. It's in theory open, but in practice not that open, and also has the possibility, especially I think the Senate, if I'm right, operates largely in secret during these early years. So that kind of carries through even past this Constitution writing moment. So can you say a little bit about how this then plays out on the other side of the Atlantic? Because so much of the work is, in fact, this, this transatlantic story. So as the Americans in the late 1780s are moving towards perhaps more insulation, what's going on in France?
Yeah, well, precisely the opposite. So in fact, something that I think is really helpful that can emerge from looking at these two revolutions together is actually just showing how important procedural decisions like that, or the architecture of meeting halls, things like that, how important they actually were to shaping what representative government looked like and how people thought about it and how it should work in these different contexts. So while the Constitutional Convention, met in this tiny room with the closed doors, and there were only 55 delegates who came there and met, there's no audience. Across the Atlantic, when the Estates General convenes in 1789, there are 1,200 elected deputies to this body. It's meeting in a vast converted storage hall outside the Versailles Palace. And on top of that, some travel writers put an estimated number of 2,000 to sometimes 4,000 unelected people who are essentially in the audience at these meetings. So when you start to think about it that way, just putting those two visuals next to each other is really powerful for helping us think about, the way in which these kinds of elected assemblies and the process of writing constitutions looked very, very different in practice in the United States versus in France.
Okay, so from that sentence, it would seem that the story that your book tells is very much of a divergence between France and the United States. But I want us to get to the 1790s and tell us a little bit about what happens in the 1790s. This, to me, was the biggest surprise of the book in a way. By 1793-4, the story has changed again. And in particular, you have a story about Jacobins and Federalists that I think is really, we should maybe say who Jacobins and Federalists are first, but
Yeah. Well, so Federalists, you have mainly, the supporters of the Constitution, and then going forward in the 1790s, James Madison kind of leaves the Federalists, and the Federalists become the party supporting Washington's administration, and they tend to carry forward this much more insulated view of representation, how it should function, and they theorize the utility for secrecy in government. They deploy that, as you talked about, the Senate met behind closed doors until 1795. Washington uses secrecy strategically a lot to kind of define executive power, all of these things. Now, in France, I talked about how they start off from a very different place. And Jacobins, who kind of are the most, we would say, radical members of what becomes the National Assembly, they're very much advocating transparency, that it's very important to reflect the people's wishes in legislation. But by the time they really come into power and dominance in the National Convention after the fall of the king in late 1792, going into 1793, we see the beginnings of them kind of changing their minds. And Federalists view Jacobins as like, anathema, like the worst. They're complete enemies. They call their political enemies in the United States Jacobins, that they're so democratic, that they're, excessively radical. And often that comes from their different policy goals. Jacobins had policy goals about economic leveling, for example, that Federalists definitely didn't have. What I found is that once Jacobins really came into power and control of the National Convention, especially with the rise of Robespierre and heading into 1793, 94, if we look at the way they actually worked in government, they really began to adopt a much more insulated vision of representation themselves. And they start to move a lot more of the work of government into secret committees, like the Committee for Public Safety. So they're moving a lot of the work off the floor of the convention. And despite continuing to really emphasize, that transparency is crucial and it's the ideal, they move into more of a state of exception to say, well, in a revolutionary period, the people is not ready yet. They don't have the right opinions yet. So it actually pushes them toward a view very similar to American Federalists of how political representation needs to work, for them, at least in the immediate revolutionary term. So for them, it's a bit more of an exceptional period when they have this insulated view, though we can see that there's no clear end in sight for them to when it would be safe to have a more reflective style of representation. And they move into a real extreme. So they kind of show the dangers of the extreme use of secrecy and this kind of extreme form of insulated representation. But it is this curious convergence that Federalists and Jacobins share in terms of how they actually govern for a period of time.
Yeah, no, and I think it's quite remarkable, really. How many books are there that claim that Federalists, as you said, hate Jacobins? They think they're completely wrong about everything. They're violently opposed to them. Those of you who remember reading about Citizen Genet, right, the great French diplomat who's the kind of great bugbear of the Federalists and of George Washington, the Jacobin diplomat. But I think part of what the power of this book is that you show that when it comes to practice, when it comes to how they're actually doing things on the ground and how they're, and not just practice in a kind of abstract sense, but the core practice of how you govern, how you run a democracy, or at least some kind of representative government, there's actually convergence in a really interesting and surprising way. So I think that's a really important really important finding. And a surprising one for anyone who's read like an American history textbook. So then you take us then through this is we're sort of in the mid 1790s, and then there's a last turn that you show at the end of the 1790s, and you've invoked it already in this turn towards spectatorship. So what does it mean to turn towards a kind of spectatorial, a spectatorship as a form of publicity?
Yeah, what I mean by that is that up to this point, through the revolutionary period, through the early 1790s, there is this association of transparency, or what people at the time called publicity. There's this association of that idea with this reflective style of politics, and the idea is sort of, well, what transparency facilitates is an active dialogue between citizens and elected officials. It's supposed to allow citizens to follow what their elected officials are doing. It's taken up by a lot of radical journalists, particularly in France, but also in the United States, as sort of implying a duty of vigilance, right? Of making sure that representatives adhere to public opinion as it's expressed. So it's associated with that. But something really interesting happens over the course of the 1790s, and here I think the Jacobins actually play a huge role in this process, which is that the Jacobins, they continue to profess this commitment to transparency and talk about it as this value, but their rhetoric starts to really diverge from their practice of governing, which is increasingly done in secret. And this kind of opening that creates leads to a really strange circumstance where after the terror, after the fall of Robespierre, you have a lot of deputies coming in and initially saying, well, the terror happened because there was too much secrecy. Because
1795-ish.
Yeah, 95, 96, they kind of start to say that's why the terror happened, actually. There was not enough transparency. It was done in secret. But that's actually a really brief moment. And what happens is that those deputies then quickly go back. They're very interested in securing a more insulated style of representation, in stabilizing the revolution. And they go back and they start to actually blame the terror on transparency. And they're able to do that because Jacobin leaders like Robespierre continue to often talk about transparency as such a central value. So they do that, and then this transparency, that kind of idea of an active, vigilance gets associated with Jacobins and really, discredited. So that's one way in which the meaning of transparency kind of changes to be something that is discredited in the form of vigilance. Another way is just that generally, like in the United States, we see more doors are gradually open to different processes over the course of the 1790s. You have someone like Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans eventually coming into power. They're very much professing a reflective style of representation. Again, very much professing the ideals of transparency, but it's of a particular kind. It's kind of a notion of a calculated broadcast of information for citizens to take in. There's kind of a notion that citizens, it's not really an active process. It's more passive, that the government, these government officials kind of, craft and determine the messages they want to put out, and that is crafted for spectators. It's not really meant to engender a dialogue. And as they open more doors, it also pushes a lot of meaningful activity, to other spaces that are closed. I think a concept we're very familiar with, today as well in the modern context.
Yeah. Well, so I really want to pick up on this notion of dialogue that you raised a few times, that actually connects to one of the questions that's already been posed by one of the audience. But before doing that, I want to pick up on the thread that the little breadcrumb that you just dropped about this being, of course, questions that are still very much with us today. And so I was wondering, if we can just spend a couple minutes before we go to taking some questions from the audience. We can just spend a couple minutes talking about how this 18th century, very 18th century story, wonderfully 18th century story that you tell is not only resonant today, but really is still, alive today. So, I think maybe the simplest way to ask that question is, where do you see the strongest echoes of this story that you're telling, and of the kind of spectatorial transparency? Where do you see those today? And by today, I really mean like the 20th century, the 21st century, not necessarily like
right now. Yeah, well, I mean, I think the thing that's really striking is actually that a lot of the debates that we still have today about the place of secrecy in a democracy in particular, and the way transparency works and the function that it serves, a lot of those debates are strikingly similar to the debates that were happening in the 18th century, with a very different media technologies and communication practices. So that's one thing. It's strikingly similar. The other thing is that I think I try to show this in the book, that we really operate still with a lot of the same connotations for secrecy and transparency that emerged in the late 18th century. So there's this common conception that secrecy endangers democracy. I mean, on the Washington Post, it says democracy dies in darkness, right? It's kind of this common idea. And in the 20th century, with the rise of state bureaucracies and the rise of the national security state, there's a lot of angst about, with so many more realms of secrecy and the expansion of government secrecy, does that endanger democracy, and inherently kind of taking things out of the hands of the people, more and more things behind closed doors. And I think that's absolutely, a concern, and that's there. And I think there are new concerns related to that, even with something like the role of PACs in campaign funding and reporting and dark money and politics. So there is this kind of concern that secrecy undermines democracy. But there's also this question about, well, is transparency always the solution to that? And actually what I try to kind of show in the book is that despite these connotations that transparency, goes with democracy, and that it's, even the essence of democracy and very necessary, that there can also be ways in which it engenders a passive spectatorship, or a kind of a passive form of citizenship. And even, in empowers demagogues and sort of
Mm-hmm.
falsehood. And I think we also see a lot of debates about that, especially in recent years, thinking about the role of the media or social media
Right.
companies in our politics, politics as spectacle and kind of entertainment, and where that's kind of led us. So I think the book shows the origins of a lot of the complexities around these questions, and just that there's not really simple answers or solutions
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
these questions.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think one of the most striking parts of the book, or one of the many striking parts of the book, is your observation in 1789, about 1789, that publicity, this kind of, truly open door publicity that you see, or public participation that you see during the early French Revolution, you argue, in fact, undermines representative government. You make quite a strong case, I think, that transparency is actually harmful to the formation of representative government in this period. And so I think, could you say the reverse? I mean, I don't want to push you into saying things that are overstated, but there does seem to be a suggestion here that a degree of secrecy is necessary for democratic representative government to exist, to function properly. Is that right? Do you think that's one
Yeah,
of the
I mean,
lessons here?
I shy away as a historian. I shy away from offering, anything prescriptive or coming down,
Sure.
on one side or the other. But I do think something, I entered this project thinking that, it's really going to show how, secrecy is very dangerous to democracy, and that transparency, really tracing the origins of how important transparency is to democracy. And I do think often that's true. There are very much dangers to excessive secrecy in a democratic government, and ways that can make the government undemocratic. And I think the Jacobin use of secrecy during the period known as the Terror kind of illustrate that potential, very much so. And linking them to the Federalists also makes us think about the ways in which some of the early formation of the United States government was undemocratic. We can debate whether that's good or bad, but I think it helps illustrate that that's true. What I came out of the project thinking, and which I didn't anticipate, was that secrecy is not always dangerous to democracy, and that in fact there can be real pitfalls of transparency. So as you say, I mean, I try to point out in the book how when we think about what transparency actually means in practice, when we're thinking about that in France in 1789, it is really, it often really empowers those who are able to show up physically, in the capital, those who are able to claim that they are the voice of the people with the loudest voice, rather than being actually the people. So that has a danger on the other extreme. And I think what happens in France early on in the revolution shows also that potential, which the Americans early on largely kind of avoid because they use more secrecy in the process. The question of whether or not that's a good or a bad thing, I'm hesitant to weigh in on, but I think it does show that, that
Right.
it's not very clear cut, and that both decisions and both styles of governing can have unanticipated outcomes, and both positive and negative impacts.
Right, right. I mean, I think that's a beautiful illustration that you just gave of the way in which, real historical work takes place, where you approach, a scene, an historical moment with a set of ideas, a thesis, and once you get into the weeds, as you just said, you really become convinced that you were not wrong, but that there was more to it than you saw at first. And that's really, I think that's a beautiful illustration of that. I want to just ask you very briefly again about, or to pick up just a little bit on this thread of the media, because the media is present very much throughout your book, and you've just invoked it in a couple of different ways in the present. To what extent do you think, or do you see in the sources that you're looking at, but again, there's an echo with the present. Um, does transparency, as you said, give a bullhorn to the people who have the means to use it in a sense, right? So, it's not the same thing to have just a random person in the galleries of Congress as to have someone there, just to use the present day analogy, someone with 1 million followers on Instagram or something, right? If they post something, then 1 million people will see it, whereas some other person, nobody will see it. So, and similarly, like in the 18th century, you have people who are sitting in the galleries of the assembly who have newspapers, right? I mean, Jacques Pierre Brissot is a famous example, right, of someone who has a newspaper that has a pretty substantial readership. So, to what extent does publicity, does transparency actually, is it really a dialogue with the people, or is it a dialogue with the people who have, how would one put it, a monopoly on media power?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and it's only become, I think, more important over time as the media has grown, and also questions like the rise of public relations and sort of an entire industry around shaping media perceptions and narratives, and that these things are profit driven often, but also just the role of money in that, in terms of who has access to government spaces and decision making processes, but also in terms of ensuring who can reach the most people or have the loudest voice. Money really distorts that a lot as well. And so I think that also kind of changes our thinking about who is that dialogue between and what does that actually look like. And even in the 18th century, a lot of people would point out and say, well, you're talking about having a dialogue with the people. And this is a fundamental problem I talk about a lot in the book. Defining the people itself is really challenging. It's not possible, like we were talking about back at the beginning, it's just, even in the 18th century, it's not possible to gather everyone together and have a conversation or say what what is in our common good. So it kind of almost necessarily becomes an abstraction, and then it's just kind of, which extreme do you tend toward in terms of who has the voice of the people?
Right.
Is it the few who are elected and that can go really far, or is it the people with the loudest voice who are the closest to political power, and that can go too far? So finding a finding a medium there is really challenging, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I think this connects actually to one of the questions that was posed by a member of the audience, which was about the concept of trust and the question of how trust figures into the story that you're telling. And I think that comes back to this question of, or is related at least to the question that the sort of topic that you raised, the idea of dialogue, because dialogue to me has a very a kind of trust based. There's a notion of knowing the other person, of being engaged with them in a kind of some sort of, I don't know if it's a face-to-face relationship, but a relationship where you are engaged in some kind of a relationship where there is some degree of trust. And is that an essential part of how does that fit in, I guess, to this publicity, transparency, and secrecy, right? Is there does one imply a lack of trust? Does one imply more trust? How do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think trust is really essential to this story. And in fact, it's really, if we think about it, at the heart of how representative democracy functions. It requires a lot of trust. It requires that the people trust that the government is representing them, and that they have a voice in that and a say in that. And early on, publicity, transparency, it really is, I think, perceived as a tool to try to establish that trust and guarantee that trust. And that's because, it's coming out of this period where secrecy is really associated with despotism, with, tricks of monarchy. And, so revolutionaries are able to come and say, no, look, we're going to show you what we're doing, as a way of establishing that kind of trust. But what I show in the book is that that gets complicated because, often you have people then saying, well, wait a minute, I don't really agree with what you as my elected official are doing. I don't really like the decision that you're making. And so actually, in a strange way, sometimes that transparency starts to erode that trust that is necessary. And sometimes, not doing everything in public view can help build that
Right.
trust or solidify that trust, or at least kind of delay that kind of discord until decisions get made and people can see, the effects of them. But yeah, I think often, often the secrecy, and when people find out, something was done in secret, that also erodes trust very much.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, trust is so elusive and so essential
Yeah.
to the whole story.
So can I follow up on that by asking you to talk a little bit about trust among representatives? Because I think so there's you've talked about the complexity of the trust that exists between, or is one wants to exist, let's say, between the people, again, a very amorphous, hard to define group, and the representatives. But what about trust among members of representative bodies? Like, how does that figure into the story that you're telling here?
Yeah, it's actually interesting, and I know that you've done some work on this too, but it's interesting to think about even the practices that elected officials use to communicate with one another. And so something I would see in a lot of times when I'm reading letters is that there are also sort of a development of different ways of writing letters to talk about, how private the letter should be, what can be shared
Mm,
as part of a building trust between
mm,
different elected officials in terms of having transparent or open conversations with one another.
right.
So that carving out of space outside of public view also becomes something that gets negotiated, in
Mm,
correspondence and also just in actual spaces of conversation or meetings and where those things happen. And
right.
often that kind of element of secrecy or privacy is essential to building that trust among elected officials.
Right. So now we have a question particularly about Elbridge Gerry. Um, uh, but I think one could open that out into a broader question about actually the various Massachusetts delegations to the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention and Congress, who do have, I think, one of their defining features is often a fairly high level of trust
Yeah.
among themselves. So, I mean, I'm wondering if you can say anything particularly, we are in an MHS sponsored event here. So, can you say anything particularly about that Massachusetts world in the 1770s, 1780s, in 1790s? How does that play in this story?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Albert Gary is a really interesting figure. Well, I don't have to tell this audience that, but he's a very interesting figure in that, one of the reasons he's really upset with the Constitution is actually over the clause that allows for secrecy in Congress in the new government. He says, we should not have allowed this, and he's very vocal about that. Um, and yeah, when he goes back to Massachusetts, he's very much like wants to give insider information, about what happened at the convention. So he's particularly interesting in that way. But I think often, especially when thinking about ratification of the Constitution, I often talk about this with my students. Who are shocked about the process in different states and the varying degrees of how democratic we might consider that process in varying states. Like in Massachusetts, actually, it's fairly democratic the way they go about that, and the role of the town meeting and actually face-to-face interaction and a
Mm,
tradition of kind of instruction and consultation. That's really strong in Massachusetts, stronger than in a lot of other states, and you see that come out through the ratification debates, particularly.
yeah, yeah, that's a very interesting point. I mean, also the kind of, I think back to Mike Zuckerman's article from many, many decades ago about the social context of democracy in Massachusetts from the late 60s, I think. But showing that there's this deep sedimentation of democratic practices, or what he calls democratic practices in the Massachusetts town meeting, as you say, and those are, of course, as you say, intersecting with these newer ideas and practices, and so that's a really well. They're the best books, as we all know, are the ones that give new questions and new incentives, and give a new generation of researchers new things to do. So I think you will have a horde of acolytes going out to find to figure out how to make how to think about secrecy and transparency at every level of government, right, all the way down to these town meetings. And God, the mind boggles thinking about what you could get out of the French archives for all of the, the individual municipal revolutions in the towns and
Oh yeah,
secrecy and transparency in those places, right?
yeah, definitely.
Um, but of course, this is not only even a French and American story. I mean, I think of the Netherlands, and one of the most famous episodes in the revolution in the Netherlands in the 1780s is, as you know well, Johan Dirk van der Capelle disseminating his to the people of the Netherlands, to every household in the Netherlands in one night, and it's a similar kind of, but he it's a secret public. I mean, he doesn't reveal his name, and so there's this
Yeah.
same play of everybody's going to see it, but nobody's going to know who wrote it. And so I
Oh yeah.
think the story that you tell here is one that has resonances both in the present, but also across the 18th century world. So
Absolutely.
um, yeah, um, I think we're almost out of time, but Olivia, you should probably say again where you can buy the book, and because everyone should buy the book. Um,
Absolutely. There is a link in the chat if you'd like to buy the book that way, but you can also support your local bookstore. So thank you very much, Caitlin and Nathan, for this wonderful discussion, and thank you to everybody for attending. And have a good
Thank you
night.
so much.